Hey guys, Andy here at mvpjava. Today I'm going to show you how to set up your Java development environment in a Docker container in just 2 commands. And I'm also going to showcase the new Netbeans 8.2 IDE, which allows us to now integrate with Docker through the Services tab, which is really nice. So there are different ways to set up our environment, which I'm going to go through. I'm going to show you guys how to download an image straight from Docker Hub through my account mvpjava. I'm going to show you also how to look at the Dockerfile in order to see what goes into building the image so we can build that and run our container. Okay, so in order to do that, we're going to need to know some essential Docker commands that every Java developer that wants to work with Docker needs to know. And I'm going to also show you how to then use that through the Netbeans 8.2 Docker Service tab. So let's start off by why. Why should we run our IDE and our developer tools in a container? Well, we all know the pain of recreating our developer environment, right? Whether it be your first day on the job, right, where they sit you in a corner and they're like, here's the wiki procedure, see you in 2 days, right? Or if you get a new laptop at work and you have to reconfigure your environment, right? That happens all the time, or even at home, your PC at home. So there are many different environments. You might be working on Windows, Mac, or Linux. It doesn't really matter. You can always find a way to run Docker. Now, in my case, I'm actually running this version here of Ubuntu. It's actually version 16.04. It's called Xenial. But if you have not installed Docker yet, I'm going to put a link in the description below, and you can actually click on that to find out what Linux distributions are supported, the commands that go for each Linux distribution, and I'll also put the commands that I had to execute to install Docker on Ubuntu 16.04, if that helps you out. Okay, so we covered the why over here, so let's look at different ways to set up our environment. One thing that you can do, right, if you trust the image, the Docker image, the person who created the Docker image, for example, myself, right? I have a username at the Docker Hub repository called mvpjava. You can actually go and say Docker, and you can pull it, right? And you can say mvpjava, and then slash, so mvpjava is the username, and then what you'll see here is a Netbeans image with a tag 8.2, right? And if you do that, it's going to first check on your local system if that image is already there. If it's there, like it is in my case, it's already going to say, hey, you already have that on your system, right? If not, in your case, it's automatically going to download from the Docker Hub, which will take obviously some time because, you know, as you're going to see later on, it's going to be a pretty big image file because Netbeans is going to be containing the whole distribution for the Java EE Netbeans release. So that's going to take a little bit of time to download. But once you've got that image, you can actually just type in Docker images, right? And then you'll see here that that's the one you just downloaded with the tag, right? Like kind of like a release number, your image ID. And you can see I did this quite a while ago, but it'll be like a couple of seconds ago or a couple of minutes ago. And here's the size of that image. So once you have an image, you can now create a Docker container. Think of it kind of like, you know, a class file, then an object kind of thing, right? So you can see that I'm using here under the hood. I'll show you that in the Dockerfile, but I'm using this release for the Linux distribution in the container. It's a very light release, meaning that it has a small memory footprint. I'm using JDK 8 in there. There's a little tag that they set up. And you can see here that that container only takes 171 megabytes. So once I added Netbeans Java EE version to it, it went all the way up to 715 megabytes. So you can see right now that even with 715 megabytes, it's still much slower than if you had, you know, come up with your whole virtual machine with its own operating system. So that overhead would have, you know, definitely brought you 2 gigabytes. And starting containers are very fast, right? They'll take seconds instead of booting up a whole OS through a virtual machine. Okay, so they're lightweight, they're fast, it's easy to install, remove, they're clean. They don't clutter up your host environment system, and the file systems are isolated. So you don't have to be worried about breaking something on your host file system, okay, your host machine. It's also very nice to take snapshots with if ever you customize them after you've built them. You don't have to have the overhead of, taking a snapshot of all your RAM at runtime, or, taking your virtual machine and shutting it down and then taking a snapshot, which kind of stops you in your terms of your productivity. And they're very easy to share after. You can actually create a ATAR file of this image and give it to somebody, right? If they don't have, let's say, an internet connection, they could recreate that environment very easily. Okay, so there is one way, like I said, to go and get that Netbeans 8.2 version with the JDK 8 in there is by just pulling it off Docker Hub. Now, I only recommend this if you trust the person, right? If you trust the business or the person that has come up with this image. In your case, you obviously trust mvpjava, right? but seriously speaking, in terms of a security point of view, you don't know what went into building that image. So, I could have put some real scary stuff in there to take control of your computer. So always make sure you download an image that's an official image from Docker Hub. If you don't trust a person, or you just want to know what went into building it, then you need a Docker file, right? So a Docker file is much like a script, right? A shell script that tells you exactly what's going on in there to build the image. So I actually have a directory here called Docker files. And in there I have a directory called Netbeans 8.2 and then Alpine for the distribution that I wanted to isolate. And in there, what you really should do is you create an empty directory, and in that directory you put a Docker file, and you have to have that name. If you don't want that name, you got to change some configuration, but it's not really worth it for the tutorial. Okay, so create a Docker file, and in that Docker file, if you vi that file or whatever text editor, I have a text editor I've already opened with it here. I've actually put in here, actually that's not the Docker file, let me vi the Docker file, that's something else that we'll cover very soon, sorry. Right, the Docker file is basically a script, like I said. And at the beginning, you need to decide what your base image is going to be. So like I said, I'm going to use a very lean and mean version of a Linux distribution that I get from this username here, and then it's Alpine is the name of the image, and it's been tagged JDK8. So that's the one that I showed you when I executed Docker images, and you saw it was only 171 megabytes. After that, I add stuff to that base image. So there's a home environmental variable that I create that I'm going to reuse in this script. I'm adding a user Netbeans. Now all this stuff over here that you see with X libraries, that has to do with the fact that since we're going to be displaying, right, Netbeans, it's not going to be some process that's just going to run in the background. You're going to be interacting with it, so we're going to need some X libraries here to interact with the X server. So that's why that's there, okay? And then I'm going to be creating some directories, kind of like mount points, that we're going to be mounting the directory on the host file system onto the directories on the file system of the container, so we can share data that's on our host file system in our container. Think of it almost like shared folders in virtual machines, okay? That's a good comparison. So over here, I'm actually creating the home.netbeans where all the plugins and the customization of your Netbeans ID is going to be stored. Also the Netbeans projects. And then I'm just going to change the user and the group for those three directories, okay? Now volumes here are very important. They actually don't need to be specifically specified in this file, okay? But the volumes will actually be a good indication of what directories the user that's going to be using this Docker file can map their local directories to. So the best practice when you're using Docker, right, a Docker container, is you don't want to store the data in the container. It's called an ephemeral container, right? You kind of want it to be reproducible. You want to have like multiple instances running, and you don't want to accidentally delete it, or maybe you do want to delete it, right? And so you don't want your data to go down the pipes with it. So the best practice is to keep your data local on your host file system and map the directory and mount it onto the volumes that are specified in this case over here in your container. And I'll show you how to do that. Setting up a user Netbeans, and here I'm downloading the 8.2 version of Netbeans. All right, and again, like I said, I'm using the Java EE version, which makes it a little bit bigger than if you were not using it. Okay, I'm using the work directory. So run is how you run a command. So I'm running a command here as the Netbeans user, and then if ever you log into the container directly through the command line, you're going to be brought to this directory. I'm going to show you how to do that, how you can on the command line directly go inside the file system of the container and execute some commands, okay, if that's what you really need to do. And then we execute the Netbeans IDE. So all this stuff is going to be done automatically for us. Now, when you build a Dockerfile, it'll go through all these steps and then it'll create that image file. Now, what I showed you before is I just pulled it. So this was already done, but it's nice to know, right? It's nice to trust what's going into that image by being able to read this. Now, this is not a full-blown Dockerfile tutorial, but you can see that it reads pretty well. If someone comes from, a background that they've done a little bit of shell scripting, it reads very well. It's got its own vocabulary, but and it can get much more involved, but usually you can get away with reading just top down without having to consult some book or something like that. So all right, so now that we got our Docker file, what you want to do is you want to build. All right, so it always starts with Docker, right? So you say Docker build, okay, -t for tag. And what you're going to do is you're going to tag this thing. So let's say you tag it at Netbeans, tag it as Netbeans. That's going to be the name of the image. And then you want to maybe put a little tag there like 8.2. And then you say dot. Now, what's going to happen is this is going to go quite fast. I'm going to go through all those steps that we just covered in a second in my case, because I've already done it. You know what I mean? In your case, it's going to go, you're probably going to stop at this one for a long time because it's a nice long download to download the java.ee.zip. Okay? So you'll definitely take a lot longer than I just did. The point is, though, after you do that, you do Docker images, and you'll see that your image is built there, like I already have it. All right. So why is it that in the command that I typed, there was a little dot there? The dot means current working directory, and in this directory right now, there's nothing but a Docker file, but eventually you can put files in this directory, and this is called your context. And you could take those files and copy them and add them to the Docker container via commands like add and copy in the Docker file. I didn't have those commands in the Docker file I showed you, but you could very well do something like that to do some customization. So this directory, although empty, you can fill it up with stuff, and that becomes your context. So I basically showed you one of those two commands that I said would take to build your Docker image, right? So first one was the build one, or you do the pull like I showed you. You decide, right? You either trust me or you want to build it yourself, okay? Then after that, you want to run your container. So in order to run your container, actually for a graphical user interface running inside a container, it's a little bit more verbose. So what I've done is I've tucked it away in a script called Netbeans Docker run, okay? And that's what I had in that gedit that I tried to show you before, but I said, oh, no, that's not the Docker file, right? So I didn't want to type this out on the command line, and you can see why, right? So it's a bash script, and I say xhost plus to start because it's a graphical user interface that has to interact with the X server. So I just want to make sure there's no permissions denied or anything like that. A little echo just to make sure that it's executing. And this is what you need, Docker run. Okay, so run these commands and create a container for me. The first argument here is --rm, which means remove the container once you're done with it. So this is what I mean by ephemeral. You can recreate this container as many times as you want. It's not storing any data, so it's the same one every single time. And you can, if you want, remove the --rm, and then we would just need to do docker start after and you reference the Docker container by name. But I decided to leave it there to show you that because you're going to see that a lot. -d means for daemon, so you want to run this in the background, and this just means that we're going on a new line here. So we want to set the display. So -e stands for environment, and display is actually by default saying equals $display. So my display variable is equal to :0 right now, so that allows me to interact with the X server, and I have to expose the X11 socket in order again to interact with the X server. The rest of the stuff is all called volume mount points. So what this does is it mounts this directory on your host file system, okay, to the directory, and then it's separated by the colon over here to the directory inside the container. So here I'm making sure that all Netbeans does in order to download my artifacts for Maven is going to be stored really on my host file system, because once I close that container, I want those to stay on my host file system, so I don't have to re-download them every single time. Or even if I have different versions of Netbeans in different containers, we'll be able to share them. Okay, so that'll be a lot better. And I do the same thing for, let's say, the Git, a hidden directory. I do the same thing for the .NetBeans directory for all the plugins and the NetBeans customizations that you want to stick around, and also for your NetBeans projects. Okay. Then I give a name to the container. So I'm going to call it NetBeans so I can easily identify it after. And I'm referencing the name of the Docker image in this case. Okay. So once you say something like Docker images, I'm talking about, you know, this one over here, NetBeans 8.2. So now I can easily say NetBeans Docker run. It's going to start, and you can see here the echo of my script, and it spits out the container ID, which we'll see there's an abbreviated version of that once we're going to do our Docker PS command. So let me just pause the video while this actually starts up. And there we go. NetBeans has started up successfully. And we can actually go back to the command line now and pull a Docker PS, right, reminiscent of PS minus EF, let's say. And you'll actually see the Docker ID that shows up here as the first couple of characters in this very long ID. And that's usually enough to specify that small ID in further commands without there being some naming collision. You can tell what image that comes from. Here's the command after we enter the work directory, which was the /data directory. We're actually executing NetBeans. And over here, we actually have the name of the container that you saw in the script. Okay. There's also another command that's interesting, and that's the Docker PS -a. And that one shows you all the containers regardless of if they're running or not. So this one here, NetBeans 8.2, is a container that's available. It's actually running now, as we can see with without the -a. But look at this one over here. This is a Mongo container that I went to go get like 2 weeks ago in preparation for the next tutorial. And you could see that it didn't show up in the Docker PS because it's not running. But it's a container that I haven't removed after I ran the Docker run command. Okay, so you can always use those two commands to see what's going on with your Docker container. So the other thing is although we have NetBeans up, we might want to go inside the container and see what's going on the directory file path. And you can do that by saying docker exec, yeah, you want to execute a command in this Docker container, -i for interactive, okay, T for a sudo shell, and then you put NetBeans. That's the name of your container, like you can just see in the above command. And then you want to execute a bash shell in that container. Once we're in there, check the IDs. You can see that you're the NetBeans user and group ID. That's exactly what was in the Dockerfile. And if you look at present working directory, like I said, when you go in there, you're going to start at the work directory, which was in the Dockerfile, which was /data. So if we go to the home directory, you'll see your NetBeans projects and all that are in there. So let's take a look here and create a new project, right? Say Java application, right? There's 4 because I've been playing around with it here. Let's finish this. And then that's it, right? You're up and running. Let's just see if this thing compiles. All the environment variables are set up properly. The JDK is up and running. Let's just play this guy. And there you go. Hi, Docker. Okay, so now what should be happening is if you go to your, let's exit this guy. If you go to your home file system, right, you should see a workspace directory. And in there, you'll see a NetBeans directory, right? NetBeans project directory. And there's your Java application for it. Actually, take a look at the hidden files. You got your .git. If we go up one level and look at the hidden files, you got your .m2 directory. So everything that we mapped in here, right, has been created for us because of the volume mount points that we specified here. Now I'm going to give you a tip, okay? Something that's a little confusing at the beginning is when you run this, if those directories do not exist, Docker will create them for you. However, if I do an ls -l here, you'll notice that right now my username and my group ID is mvpjava, but they'll actually be root. And this is going to be a huge pain in the ass, because what's going to happen is if you don't have root access or are not a sudo user, then you won't be able to access the data that you yourself created via the container. So my advice to you is to create those directories as that user before Docker gets a hold of them, okay? So there are ways to get around that, but honestly, they're not pretty, and Docker, I hope, is going to alleviate some of this pain, because this is a pain point for a lot of people, right? Docker is still growing, still in growing pains. It's still still a young technology. It needs to mature a little bit more. And this is one of the features that a lot of people have been complaining about, is not being able to, go back into the directories that the Docker container created for them, because they didn't exist before they ran this command. So create them first, and you're not going to have this problem. All right, so let's continue. So like I said, in Netbeans 8.2, in the Services tab now, you have a nice Docker service here, which allows you, let me just scooch this down over here, to interact with your Docker host. And you can see that these are all my images that I showed you before through the Docker images command. And you can just click on it, run it, push it, tag it, and all these commands over here. And similarly with the containers, you can see that this one is running here, but I can take my Mongo container and I can just start it. Okay, so I don't have to go through a Docker run command or anything like that. And I'm just gonna stop it here as well. So it allows you to bypass going through the console and executing a whole bunch of commands. I like it very much. And I made it a point to actually create an image with 8.2. Now, when you're not going to have this, right? When you're going to set up, you're going to come here. This Docker host is not going to be here, and you're going to click here, and you're just going to say add Docker, and this is what's going to show up here. Unfortunately, when you're going to say test connection, you're going to get this message over here. You say cannot establish connection, and that's because your Docker, for two reasons. One, your Docker host is actually not running locally in the container, right? It's running on the host, and two, because of that. Or rather, two, the Docker daemon, is not accepting remote connections by default. It will actually depend on the distribution you have. In my distribution, it didn't allow it out of the box, so I had to configure it to allow remote hosts to connect via TCP socket. I'm going to show you kind of what I had to do. But first off, let me show you here. Go back to my host. If I say ifconfig, you'll see here that there's a Docker 0. So the Docker 0 is there to allow the containers to communicate together. And you'll see that this is the IP I should be using instead of the local host that I have there. So let's go back to Netbeans. So 1.127 I said. Let's go over here at Docker. I have a terrible memory. What was that? 172.17.0.1, right? Once you do that, test connection. All right, connection succeeded, and then you would be able to see something. But this is only part of the solution. What you got to do is, it's a little bit of a pain point. Let's say I show you the processes and I grep for Docker, all right? What you might have is you might just have out of the Docker daemon, you just might have -h and with this file descriptor, and it stops there. But what you really need is this. You need to add that as extra arguments to the startup process. So this is opening a TCP port that'll allow remote clients to connect to it. So I don't know your IP address, so I just binded it to 0.0.0.0. It means it can connect to any. And I kept the port number 2375. So this is unencrypted. If you want to encrypt it, there's other steps to do it, and you go usually on port 2376. What I'm going to do, because this is Linux kind of distribution dependent, is I'm going to put the commands that I use for Ubuntu to actually set this -h parameter up and to restart the service in the description below. But I'll also put the official Docker link that you can go check the steps to do for any other Linux distribution. So once you've got that, right, you can definitely connect to your Docker instance, and then you're off to the races here, and you can interact your IDE with your Docker Hub. And I guess the next point, right, there's two ways to close this. I can actually come here and say exit, and it will close the Docker container automatically. Or you can actually, if you forgot the name, you say Docker PS, and you can say Docker stop and the name of the container, which you see here, right? So either way works. Just want to show you another command, and there's stop and there's start and there's restart. But because we used the -rm, what's going to happen is once you run the docker ps command, you'll notice that, or even -a, you'll notice that it's not there anymore. And the reason it's not there anymore because we've said -rm. So now, if you actually would remove this, right? Let's just say I save this and I come back here and I just go to my scripts directory and I run this guy again. Now it's going to take a little bit of time, so let me just pause this one last time. So there we have it. It came back up, no problem, as we knew it would. And now if you again execute the stop command, right? Put that stop. Oh, what did I do there? Stop. It'll come down, and this time, because it didn't use the -rm command, it's going to persist in terms of sticking around as a Docker container. And now when we do docker ps -a, you'll see that it's stuck around there. So you can actually now not have to go through the script anymore, and you can just say docker start and the name of the container, right? And boom, off it goes again. Okay, so we're having fun here. So there's not a lot of commands to know, right? There's either you're either pulling it from Docker Hub, you're building the Docker file to create an image, or you're running it and then starting it, or just running it all the time. It depends if you have the -rm switch or not, like I showed you. So you got a lot of variations there, but there's not many commands, and the commands that I showed you, you should know, okay? Because if you want to go on the Docker boat, then you just got to know them. All right, so in terms of what's next, let me just wait for this pop-up to go away because it's taking the focus. There you go, got that out of the way. So in terms of what's next, we got some outgoing questions for sure, right? Now we see the benefit of running your Java development environment in a Docker container, whatever it could be. Like I said, you could have IntelliJ, you could have Eclipse. It doesn't matter. You know the steps to go through it now. You can use that Dockerfile and tailor it. Actually, that's what I did. There was a Dockerfile already out there with Netbeans 8.1, and I said, well, you know what? I'd love to try Netbeans 8.2. I couldn't find anybody with Netbeans 8.2, so I did it myself. So you have it available on Docker Hub if you want it, and I'll put the Docker file on my where I put my code in those zip folders that I have on Google Drive. You can always go get it there, and you can get the same environment as I have very, very quickly. So in terms of outgoing questions, obviously the next thing is like, how do I run an application? How do I run my database, whether it be Mongo? How to run a web server with this? Can I run them in different containers? Because that's really what the Docker way is, running an application per container for scalability. And then spawning multiple instances and have them all communicate together. And how do I address orchestrating all of that? I've heard of Docker Compose. I've heard of Docker Compose.yaml files. How do I go about that? Well, I'm going to address that in future tutorials that are coming probably in a couple of weeks. I'm also going to eventually address outgoing questions that you might have, like how does this fit in to a continuous environment architecture? Let's say you're using Jenkins and you want to have these images become your new artifacts, right? You want to interact with Git and all this stuff. Or even if you want to, how does this work with Spring Boot? I'm a big user of Spring Boot. So all these questions are valid questions that are now in your mind once you see something like this, and I'm going to be covering all this. And if you want to see those videos come out, I highly suggest you subscribe to the channel so you can get notified of them. And that's it for me, guys. So thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, subscribe, or share. And until next time, ciao.